In every conversation, in every social gathering, there are those who seem to carry an invisible measuring stick. They assess. They evaluate. They form conclusions with remarkable speed. These are people who are too judgmental, individuals whose minds seem perpetually occupied with the work of sorting the world into categories of right and wrong, acceptable and unacceptable, worthy and unworthy. They notice the small infractions others miss. The grammatical error in a casual text message. The slightly worn shoes someone wore to a meeting. The parenting choice that differs from their own. They catalog these observations, filing them away in an internal ledger that never quite balances in anyone else's favor. But if you look closer, you'll notice something unexpected. Their harshest judgments are rarely spoken aloud with cruelty. Often, these individuals seem genuinely confused when others perceive them as critical. In their own experience, they're simply observing reality, noting what is objectively true. They don't understand why others become defensive when they're merely pointing out facts. These are people who have learned to navigate uncertainty by constructing rigid frameworks of evaluation, and in doing so, have inadvertently built a prison whose walls confine them most of all. Watch them long enough and you'll see the pattern manifest in predictable ways. In conversations, they struggle to simply listen without internally critiquing. While someone shares a story, their mind is already formulating opinions about the choices being described, the implications being missed, the better path that should have been taken. Their facial expressions often betray this internal process, a slight narrowing of the eyes, a barely perceptible tightening of the jaw, a pause that carries weight. In relationships, they tend to occupy the role of the one who sees clearly, who notices what others overlook, who understands the real dynamics at play. They become the person others stop confiding in, not because they're malicious, but because every vulnerability shared somehow transforms into a teaching moment or an opportunity for correction. The friend who mentions struggling with their diet hears unsolicited advice about willpower. The colleague who admits uncertainty receives a lecture about proper planning. At work or in daily life, they're the ones who can identify every inefficiency, every suboptimal choice, every instance where someone fell short of an unstated standard. They see themselves as quality controllers in a world that desperately needs their discernment. To them, remaining silent about observed flaws feels like complicity, like abandoning responsibility. To outsiders, it might seem like these individuals simply enjoy feeling superior, like they derive pleasure from putting others down. But that's not what's actually happening. What most people don't understand is that this isn't just snobbery or ego. Psychologically, this is hypervigilant evaluation as a defense mechanism, a learned strategy for managing profound internal anxiety about worthiness and belonging. Their brain has adapted to constantly scan for flaws and deviations because somewhere in their history, acceptance felt conditional. Perhaps they grew up in an environment where love was performance-based, where approval had to be earned through meeting exacting standards. Maybe they learned that being right was the only reliable source of value in a household where other forms of connection felt unstable or unpredictable. It's a learned response, and like all learned responses, it serves a purpose, even when that purpose has outlived its usefulness. Here's what's really happening beneath the surface. When they encounter behavior that deviates from their internal rulebook, their nervous system registers it as a threat. Not a threat to their physical safety, but a threat to the entire cognitive framework they've constructed to make sense of a chaotic world. If those rules can be broken, if people can be acceptable even while making wrong choices, then what does that say about all the self-denial and rigidity they've imposed on themselves? They're not consciously choosing to judge. They're responding to what psychologists call cognitive dissonance. the profound discomfort that arises when we encounter information that contradicts our core beliefs. For someone whose sense of safety depends on the existence of clear, consistent rules about right and wrong, every violation of those rules creates internal turbulence that demands resolution. This is what psychologists call black and white thinking or splitting, a cognitive pattern where the mind struggles to hold complexity and nuance, instead categorizing everything into opposing extremes: good or bad, right or wrong, acceptable or unacceptable. No middle ground. No shades of gray. In their inner world, this binary thinking feels protective. It provides clarity in a fundamentally ambiguous universe. It offers the illusion of control when so much of life is uncontrollable. If they can just identify the rules clearly enough, follow them precisely enough, and help others see them too, then maybe, just maybe, they can engineer safety in a world that once felt deeply unsafe. But here's where it gets complex. The same mechanism that once protected them now isolates them. They become incredibly skilled at analysis, at pattern recognition, at identifying inconsistencies and logical flaws. Their attention to detail can be genuinely valuable in certain contexts: quality assurance, editing, systems analysis, anywhere that precision matters. Yet they quietly struggle with intimacy. Because true intimacy requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires temporarily suspending judgment, both of others and of oneself. It demands acceptance of imperfection, tolerance for ambiguity, comfort with the mess of human complexity. And for someone whose entire psychological architecture is built on clear categorization and rigid evaluation, that kind of acceptance feels dangerous. It's not that they don't want connection. It's that their entire system is wired to prioritize certainty over closeness, clarity over compassion, being right over being related. What looks like superiority is actually profound insecurity. They're not confident in their judgments. They're desperately seeking confirmation that their internal rulebook is correct, because if it isn't, they'll have to face the terrifying possibility that they've been unnecessarily restricting themselves for years. Every person who lives differently and seems fine anyway is an unwelcome challenge to the framework that's supposed to keep them safe. They've mastered the appearance of discernment, but quietly struggle with self-compassion. The same harsh lens they turn on others, they turn on themselves, often with even greater intensity. Their internal dialogue is a constant performance review where they rarely meet their own standards. The judgment they project outward is merely the visible portion of a much larger phenomenon happening in the privacy of their own consciousness. For the people in their lives, this pattern creates a peculiar kind of exhaustion. Friends might feel perpetually evaluated, as though every interaction is a test they didn't know they were taking. The spontaneity drains from relationships when you're always conscious of being assessed. Laughter becomes harder. Authenticity retreats. Partners often experience a dynamic where they can never quite measure up. Not because the judgmental person doesn't love them, but because the goalposts of acceptability keep shifting. There's always something that could be better, some area for improvement, some gap between reality and the ideal. The partner finds themselves either constantly defending their choices or, more commonly, slowly shrinking, sharing less, risking less, becoming smaller in the relationship. Family members may interpret it as rejection, not realizing it's actually a distorted form of care. When a judgmental parent critiques their adult child's life choices, they genuinely believe they're helping. They can't see that their attempts to improve and protect have transformed into something that wounds. They don't understand why their children stop calling, why conversations become superficial, why there's distance where they wanted closeness. And here's the paradox they live with: the more they judge, the more they isolate themselves. The more they isolate themselves, the more their worldview narrows. And the narrower their worldview becomes, the more rigid and judgmental they grow. It's a self-reinforcing cycle that intensifies over time. They want respect but find themselves avoided. They want to help but watch people pull away. They want meaningful relationships but discover that depth requires a softness they've trained themselves to fear. And in studying these individuals, we find something universal. Their struggle illuminates a truth about human psychology itself. We all navigate the tension between structure and flexibility, between standards and acceptance, between the need for clarity and the reality of ambiguity. These people simply embody an extreme version of something present in all of us, that impulse to organize experience into categories, to make sense of the senseless by imposing order. We all judge. We all evaluate. We all have internal frameworks for understanding what's acceptable and what isn't. Their intensity reveals what exists in smaller doses across all of us, that fundamental challenge of holding our values firmly while remaining open to the validity of different approaches. The question isn't whether we judge, but how flexibly we can hold those judgments, how much room we can make for perspectives that differ from our own. But here's what's often missed. This pattern, for all its costs, carries wisdom. These individuals have developed an extraordinary capacity for discernment. They can identify problems others overlook. They understand systems, patterns, cause and effect in ways others might never grasp. Their analytical minds can be gifts in the right context. Their sensitivity to inconsistency has made them reliable, principled, committed to integrity. When they say they'll do something, they do it. When they identify a problem, they're usually correct about its existence, even if their proposed solution lacks nuance. Their experience with holding themselves to high standards has given them discipline, follow-through, and often genuine competence. It's not a flaw to be fixed, it's an adaptation to be understood. Not broken, just calibrated for a world that no longer exists. Their internal alarm system is still responding to childhood conditions, still protecting them from threats that have long since passed. For those who recognize this pattern in someone they know, or in themselves, understanding is the first step, but not the destination. These individuals need environments where their analytical gifts are valued while their rigidity is gently challenged. They benefit from relationships with people who can receive their observations without becoming defensive, while also setting clear boundaries about unsolicited advice. What doesn't help is either accommodating their judgments endlessly or attacking them for being critical. Both responses confirm their existing worldview. Their healing doesn't look like becoming less perceptive or abandoning their standards entirely. It looks like developing what psychologists call cognitive flexibility, the capacity to hold their perspective while genuinely considering that other perspectives might be equally valid. It looks like learning that complexity isn't dangerous, that ambiguity isn't failure, that different can be neutral rather than wrong. Slowly, with the right support, they can begin to notice their judgments without immediately acting on them. They can practice the radical act of observing without evaluating, of witnessing without correcting. Not by eliminating their analytical nature, but by adding a layer of curiosity before judgment, asking, why might someone choose this? Before concluding, this is wrong. They can learn that their worth isn't dependent on being right, that connection matters more than correction, that being understood often creates more positive change than being critiqued. They can discover that the world doesn't fall apart when they soften their grip on certainty. So when you encounter someone like this, remember, they're not choosing difficulty. They're navigating an internal world most people never see, one where relaxing their vigilance feels genuinely dangerous, where accepting imperfection seems like moral failure, where softening their stance threatens the entire structure they've built for psychological survival. What appears as arrogance is anxiety. Where others see judgment, there's fear. Fear of chaos, fear of worthlessness, fear that without these rigid standards, they might discover they've always been fundamentally unacceptable. Think of them as cartographers who grew up in unmapped territory, who learned to survive by drawing increasingly detailed maps of acceptable behavior. And now, even though the territory has changed, even though they're no longer lost, they can't stop drawing, can't stop refining, can't stop pointing out where others have strayed from the routes they've so carefully marked. These are people who learn to judge because they were judged, who became rigid because flexibility once felt life-threatening, who critique others because they've never learned to offer themselves grace. And perhaps that's worth recognizing, not as pathology, but as part of the vast spectrum of human experience. Perhaps, in their struggle, we can see our own smaller judgments reflected back at larger scale. Perhaps in extending compassion to them, we practice the very flexibility they're learning to develop. Perhaps their journey towards softness can remind us all that certainty is sometimes the opposite of wisdom, that holding our opinions loosely might be the strongest position of all. Because in the end, we're all just trying to feel safe in a world that offers no guarantees, trying to make sense of experiences that resist neat categorization, trying to protect ourselves from vulnerabilities we don't always understand. Some of us learned to do it through judgment, others through different strategies. But the underlying need, to belong, to matter, to be okay as we are, that's universal. And maybe, just maybe, recognizing that shared need is the beginning of the grace we all require.